Good morning, everybody. Welcome to September's Leadership Live. We'll begin here since we're 2 after 10:02. So you guys see the PowerPoint? Everything's good? You guys see the slides? There we go. So we'll go into the September Leadership Live by Tarence Lauchiè, and he is no stranger to these. But before we introduce him, we would start our why. So our why is to multiply the blessings and opportunities that have been put onto our trust. And by doing so, we've been hosting these leadership lives going back probably 10 plus years. It used to be Pro VU and kind of cater it and switch it up more Rosewood. So all the companies and every department are welcome to join this leadership live, especially how much we've grown with different departments or different companies. New this year, so we've already finished up 2 quarters. So we finished up professional growth and creating a great team. And we're finishing up this month after this one, we're going to be finishing up Q3, overcoming obstacles. And we have Tarence Lauchiè here to talk to us about workplace conflict management and resolutions. So Tarence Lauchiè has done one earlier in the year. I think this is your second or third, Tarence?
I think it's the third one this year.
Third one this year. So I think that's the record right there from our guest speaker. You're probably tied into it as much as any other one. So good to have you. Shows that, we love having you as a guest to go in and educate us and just kind of go with the ins and outs of all this. So Tarence Lauchiè, floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. I appreciate it. And thank you to the entire Rosewood family and Campbell University for allowing me to be a part of this. I feel like I'm a part of the extended team here in Michigan. I'm in Grand Rapids and the weather's beautiful this fall day, and we've got just a few more weeks before probably we'll get some snow. So I don't know where everybody is, but hopefully you've got some good weather and some things to digest today's session. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. My volume's pretty good. Great. Well, we're going to be talking about conflict management as well as conflict resolution today, and it's a subject or a topic that I find to be interesting because there's a lot of perspective. Everybody's got kind of an opinion. And one of the things that I like to offer is what we call cognitive dissonance. I want to shake up your thinking a little bit and cause you to look at this from a different way or a different perspective. Conflict management. How do we manage conflict? And then there's resolution. Putting management and resolution in the same sentence is oftentimes an oxymoron because management sometimes will be the conflict in people's mind. Being to deal with conflict in a positive way, we want management as well as the ability to resolve this issue that we call conflict. Anything can be a conflict. Let's go to the definition, Antonio. That's the next slide. The definition that we're working from in dealing with this particular subject is that conflict can be a physical or mental struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs. I want to pause and slow down on these words: needs, drives, wishes, or external or internal demands. Needs, drives, wishes, or external or internal demands. And the demands, of course, don't necessarily have to be grievous or opposing any values of an organization or an individual's personal work ethics, but we demand things that we want, that we need, the drives, the wishes, and those desires are oftentimes what we bring to work with us, no matter what level of leadership we're in or what level of servitude we're in. We find ourselves having the need. If it's manual labor, we need tools. But if there's a shortage of tools or, for example, perhaps a conflict in being able to get the resources that's needed, conflict ensues, or we have conflict. You can advance to the next slide. Wanted to give you this quote. Mahatma Gandhi made this statement: peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to cope with it, which means that the opposite of conflict is not peace. The opposite of conflict is resolution. Now, resolution is a pretty fluid word, and I won't give you the textbook definition. I'll just give you kind of a informal definition that resolution is that we can keep moving forward. Resolution is that we've resolved that things are well enough to continue to move forward. And so if Mahatma Gandhi, who's pretty much renowned for his ability to act nonviolently and to be a champion of peace through conflict, he has something pretty substantive here, that it's not the absence of conflict, it's the ability to cope with it. Let's go to the next slide. Where I find most of our understanding about conflict resides pretty much in our mental capacity to understand it. Those who are introverts probably oppose conflict on every hand, and those who are extroverts sometimes will even welcome conflict when we look at it from a positive perspective. So let's look at attitude and conflicts. A positive attitude can serve you well when you face challenges or setbacks. It breeds resilience. So coupled with a strong work ethic, a positive attitude helps to build strong relationships with teammates as well as superiors or those that we report to. This is an important element in this training today because attitude is everything. It was Chuck Swindoll that said that life is probably 10% of what happens to me, but 90% of how I deal with it or how I respond to it. So when we look at conflict, whether we are introverted or extroverted, we have to look at it from a positive perspective, that it's obviously a miscommunication or disconnect between what a person's needs and wants are and their ability to obtain it or receive it. And that's from another person or from a machine or from a system. I'm doing some educational leadership training, doctoral work right now, and an area of study is organizations and organizational behavior. Organizations are oftentimes described as metaphors, machines, maybe animals, things of nature. And when you stop and think about every job that we're working on, every assignment, every task, every project could take on the same type of metaphor. When we have conflict, those metaphors or those examples of the job or the task could be distorted. So for example, the term "it's a jungle out there" is a term that people use metaphorically to talk about how chaotic and different and challenging a space or an environment may be. Say we're working on a project and we use a metaphor to describe that project, that this project is a bear, meaning a bear. It's hungry, it's aggressive, it's carnivorous, and we describe it as such. And then as that project continues to progress, it becomes more of, let's say, a lamb. We're able to docilize it, bring it down to peaceable and palatable actions to get along with. I use the analogies of metaphors because conflict in our minds and within us oftentimes take on metaphors and we respond accordingly. The goal would be to have the right attitude, the right perspective in order to paint the right picture to get the job done, to resolve the conflict, to bring resolution. And as this slide indicates, there is some resilience that is built when we have a positive attitude, even in the midst of conflict or even in the midst of situations where people may or may not get along. So hopefully those metaphors, start thinking about your job and what you do metaphorically. Is it like a journey? Is it like climbing a hill, or maybe gliding on the winds or the waves of the sea? So you can use metaphors to describe it. And those are great tools to help us to avert conflict or maybe even deal with conflict if we have a positive attitude. Let's take a look at the next slide. And I'm going to have a segment where you can pipe in or ask questions in just a moment. Albert Einstein, pretty smart guy from what I understand, made this statement. He says, weakness of attitude becomes weakness of character. So if our positive attitude is somehow distorted or a positive attitude is left at home or we're at work, we show signs of weakness, but it's signs of weakness in our character. And when we say weakness, we're talking about the inability to uphold under pressure or to work or to operate in environments that challenge us. So the weakness of attitude really is a reflection of our character. Hopefully you're following along with what I'm laying down here, that we have a responsibility for our own character. We also have a responsibility for our own attitude, but our attitude is what we bring into conflict situations. So I'm kind of drawing a map to connect attitude, positive attitude specifically, with confronting, dealing with, and resolving conflict. And it's all a matter of character. Our next slide deals with how we handle conflict. I'd like to pause just for a moment, maybe get a couple of people to go off of mute and answer the question. How do you typically handle conflict? I've got some tips, some techniques, but I want to hear from you guys. A couple of people might want to pipe in. How do you handle conflict?
by communicating, just being transparent and open, and kind of just talking about what is the misunderstanding, or what, because someone could just be confused about what's going on, or get someone's point of view. So just communicating, I guess.
Sure. So communication. Let's jot that down and make a mental note. Communication, and I know that chat is an option here for us to be able to drop in some thoughts. But communication, I like that. Thanks, Antonio. Anybody else?
I'd like to add to that. Just this is what Antonio was saying, was seeking to understand. Sometimes my perspective or understanding may not be reality, so I want to make sure we're on the same page.
Which means my metaphor can be distorted. my thought process of everything being peaceful and gentle and kind could be distorted, and then I've got some disconnect. Thanks, Byron. That's a good one as well. I think we got time for at least one more.
Yeah, I try to find common ground and, find a compromise that's suitable to both parties.
I like that, compromise. I think that's important, because when we're willing to negotiate, the conflict usually dies down just a little bit. I'm noticing your screen in the background, Dan. I'm a Lions fan as well, from Detroit originally, and that could create—
Go green.
Go green, right? I'm a Spartan as well, but that could cause conflict. Just the fact that you're a Lions fan. I mean, think about it. That team doesn't have the best reputation, but hey, Lions fans are diehard fans, right? We are ride or die, or ride and die. How about that?
Very resilient.
Very resilient. Thanks, Dan. Let's look at the next slide. Here's some ideas, because they build off of what you already mentioned, or what has been mentioned, is that communication is a very important key. But I want to show you the art, or at least share with you this model called the ACT model, the ACT model of managing conflict. And the A, of course, is approach. And I'm going to break down approach in just a minute with the AAA component or way of looking at it. But communication style, and I think it was Antonio that mentioned communicate. Let's talk, let's communicate. And then tactics. We'll look at tactics, because the way that we communicate is just as important as the communication itself. Meaning that we can say what we want to say, we can try to express what it is that we're feeling, but communication is a two-way transactional process between a sender and a receiver. There's a message involved, and then there's oftentimes other elements like noise or feedback and other conflicts. And so looking at all three of these, the ACT model, ACT model, starts with approach. How do we approach through escalation? We have no other choice but to go in and deal with a conflict. And then there are intentional times in which we'll go into a conversation, a confrontation, and keep that word in the forefront of your mind, or maybe even a meeting. Sometimes meetings become conflict arenas, and sometimes they become platforms or places in which we deal with a person's opposition of a thought. So let's look at the next slide. There's this AAA approach that we want to get to, but let me revisit communication first. The A is approach, but the C is communication. And the reason I pause here is because I learned communication in undergrad as an undergrad major in communication and education. And it's always stuck with me that communication is probably the most important soft skill that we can have, because the other soft skills that are in operation are really built on our ability to communicate clearly and professionally. Communication is more than just really sending the message, it's also the ability to listen or to receive the message actively, and also hearing what isn't being said. So if someone is saying something to me, I can hear the words that are coming out of their mouth. I can probably even see the fervor or the zeal or excitement that they use to express themselves. But can I really listen to hear what is being said or what's not being said? That's one of the tactics or techniques or even approaches to resolving conflict, is to listen to what people are saying and also listen to what they're not saying. Let's look at the next slide. Just wanted to, I know that I took those out of order. Let's go back to the A's, which is an approach that, or the word approach, but I found that there are always alternatives, not necessarily to the conflict, but to the situation. the situation that breeds the conflict, we can look for alternatives. How can we do this differently? Or how can we manage this better? I just had this charming 3-year-old come to the window to see Poppy. Sorry about that. He's trying to open the door. All right, so alternatives could be that when we're dealing or facing a conflict, that we can think of ways to take another road to avoid damage or to avoid hardship. Now, the word avoid, I just mentioned in alternatives, but it stands alone, that sometimes people avoid conflict in general to maybe even pass it on to somebody else, or to keep from having to confront situations that are inevitable. I don't suggest that being a long-term approach, but it could be that in certain situations, you may want to use avoidance to keep, let's see, the process going, or maybe to avoid some further damage. But always think we've got to schedule this at another time. We've got to deal with this situation later. Acceptance. And acceptance is the third approach. I accept the fact that we are at odds. I accept the fact that we don't see eye to eye. I accept the fact that the way I do things is different than the way you do things. Well, that approach is a humbling approach, but it's also a very realistic approach. So think about the alternatives, avoiding damage by timing the confrontation, and then, of course, possibly approaching it from an acceptance. I accept that these things don't match up. You know, I was a avid Sesame Street kid. I grew up watching Sesame Street, and even as an adult, I use it often in analogies. There was a segment that they would show opposites, and they would show pictures, maybe 3 pictures of 3 objects, 2 of which were in the same category, and they are like one another. And then one was odd. And the song would be, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things doesn't belong. If you guess which thing is not like the other, then it's time to end our song. Now, some of you who have kids or grandchildren, nieces and nephews, and you're still a Sesame Street fan, there's probably a 2023 version of that, or 2022 version of that. But I learned that lesson early on, that there are some situations where things don't match, things don't fit. Now, that's early teaching of conflict, being able to identify when something just simply does not fit. And so part of the approach to resolving conflict would be to accept the fact that this isn't a good dynamic or a good relationship or a good procedure or a good product. No matter how I feel about it, proof is telling me that it's not working. And so we have to keep that in the forefront of our mind, along with confrontation. All right, let's go to that next slide, Antonio, so that I can share with you how workplaces in an ideal scenario are built. They're built on relationships, transparency practiced, not just simply stated, but practiced, and then also creating environments of trust. Now, of course, relationships and transparency should move us to environments of trust, but that has to be intentional as well. When I talked about things not being the same or some things not fitting, it's easier to deal with the opposition of something not fitting in an environment if there's relationship and transparency, because trust is an inevitable product of those two. And so ideal workspaces have trust factors that are built on transparency. That's 2-way. I'm actually looking through a 2-way glass, and so I can see transparently the people or the person on the other side. And then building relationship has to be intentional. Notice I'm going up and down this example here. So we have to have all 3 of these in order for the workplace to be ideal in dealing with conflict, or ideal in dealing with confrontation, which means we're handling conflict. Let's pause right here for some interjection. Anybody had any thoughts or revelation on this? Maybe something to add or clarity?
I thought it was interesting. Oh, I hear somebody. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Shonda. No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I thought it was interesting how you said you can kind of move through these 3 and kind of move them around. It doesn't necessarily have to go in order. It could be that you practice transparency, which in turn builds relationships and then creates a trusting environment. So I like the fact that it's, not just one way, that these things can occur in any order.
Absolutely.
That just kind of stood out to me.
That's good observation, because you might even work in an environment, and say you're new to an environment that's already trusting, but the last environment that you came from is not a trusting environment, or you may have situations in addition to your workspace where transparency and relationships are being challenged. Well, if we look at this being as an objective for an ideal work relationship or work scenario, we'll begin to buy into it. So they don't necessarily go in order. Was that Byron, or who else had their hand up or was going to say something?
No, it was me, Terrence. Scott and Shanda just nailed it, because I was going to say sometimes you need to establish trust before you can establish a relationship. So the fact that these things are important, but not necessarily in this order, was just the point I was going to question.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. I think when it comes to implementing or applying principles such as relationship building or transparency and then trusting environments, they're gonna come at us in different ways. And there are different people vested at different levels. So for example, if I'm the introvert who highly appreciates and highly prioritizes relationship, transparency is going to be somewhat of an internal conflict because of my introversion, but not for the people that I'm in relationship with. So as you can see, the internal conflicts that we talked about during the definition, the attitude, perspective, outlook, has to be overcome first by the individual before it can really be mastered in an environment where we're trying to resolve conflicts. So what am I saying? I'm saying that it's really up to us individually to embrace ideal workplace scenarios, considering our different styles, considering that introversion, extroversion, or even utilizing some of the personality assessments, we have different styles. But these three things, if we keep them as priorities, I believe what happens is that we start moving towards spaces where we can see conflict, we can deal with conflict, and in some cases avert conflict. Thanks for those comments. Anybody else? Great, we'll move to the next slide. Back on the communication thing. This whole communication tip is that if we can learn how to perfect, improve, or master our communication skill sets, what happens is that we put ourselves in a position where we are in an advantage. Because our vocabulary, our ability to verbally communicate is words, it's limited to words verbally, there's some limitations because you only got so many words. It's believed that we probably have close to 250,000 words in our vocabulary that we could use in any given day. Most people don't use half of those. We live in a world or society where nonverbal communication is practiced often, depending on how you look at it. If you've got a telephone device and you're clicking and sending messages, even though you're writing out words, you're not audibly speaking those words. I oftentimes will do voice text to text, and somehow the apparatus picks up words that I didn't say. So verbal communication could easily be twisted, and you got to be careful about the automatic correct and the automatic spell check, because sometimes it'll be words that you didn't intend to say, and they could be considered profane if you're not careful. So nonverbal communication has to be monitored. Nonverbal communication is something that we have to consider. What does it look like with my body and the words that are coming out of my mouth? What about my eye contact? I'm able to look and see some of you because you have your cameras on, and then others don't, so I can't really look at you, but I'm making myself available through cameras so you can look into my eyes when I talk. Eye contact is important when you're resolving conflict or even trying to manage issues that are conflicting, looking at people and letting them know, yes, trust is here, or yes, it is an environment where you can see transparently how I feel or what I think because my eyes tell the story. I'm a avid student of the ancient text, the scripture, and there is a passage specifically that tells us that the eyes are the window to the soul. And that when our eye is pure, everything within us is reflective as such. But when we have an evil eye or an eye that looks at things in a negative way, then everything's corrupt. And I'm paraphrasing because our ability to look at a person, our ability to both proverbially and actually see how a person is responding to me weighs more heavy than just the words. I can say I'm sorry and still have a look of grimace on my face, or I can avoid eye contact as not to be transparent or as not to engage. Oftentimes tell my wife when we are in other countries or other places, and we don't understand the culture just yet, or we're just landing as tourists. I says, try to avoid direct eye contact except for the person that you're talking to. Don't just gaze and get eye contact with people, because what happens is that you're inviting them to communicate or to connect with you. Try to stay focused with eye contact to the person that you're dealing with in the conflict, so that they will know that you're serious and they will know that you're engaged and invested in resolving the conflict. The other thing is the space and the environment. It's important for the space and the environment to be conducive for conflict resolution, because it may not be appropriate to resolve the conflict in the immediacy of that moment. Say, for example, we're working in a space where there's lots of noise, lots of distraction, lots of activities. That may not be the place to resolve the conflict. It could be a place for compromise. And I think Dan mentioned that a little bit earlier. Maybe negotiable, hey, I need to talk to you in just a few minutes. Or, as we've seen on many of the cop shows, in my office now. Well, the environment is everything. We have to be able to create the space that will allow us to be heard, to maybe create an environment of peace, being able to sit down and sit eye to eye, as opposed to standing over an individual while correcting them or trying to resolve a conflict, or having to look up to a person and respond to them, especially if they're your boss. That's inferior, or it makes you feel somewhat inferior. Sometimes people's stature is larger than someone else's or smaller than someone else's. So space and environment play a very significant role in the nonverbal communication process of resolving conflict. Any questions or thoughts? I hope I'm not moving too fast, but I know I've got quite a few slides to get through. Great, let's go to the next one, Antonio, thanks. So how do we improve our nonverbal communication? Because nonverbal communication is 70% of how we communicate. Some theories say 75%. I've even heard people say 99%. I think what happens is that we become exaggerant with our percentages unless we're doing quantitative assessments on a regular basis. This may fluctuate. There may be instances where you are is about 70%, or your visible capacity is at 70%. I don't know if there are any statistics on how much our nonverbal communication is diminished when we are online versus in person. I'm not too sure about that, but let's pay attention to how we use our bodies. If you notice, I'm using my hands. That's because I'm standing. If I were sitting in my favorite little chair here, chances are I'd be leaning forward or a little bit more relaxed. Whereas if I can use my hands, especially in instruction, I can describe opening up, I can describe closing, I can describe pausing or stopping, or I can describe welcoming or inviting. So if you notice the hands, if you notice my hands play a significant part in what it is that I'm saying, and my hands should coincide with the words that are coming out of my mouth, as opposed to being all over the place like the robot on Lost in Space. I know there's some young folks on here that may not remember Lost in Space, but Will Rogers had a robot whose hands went crazy whenever there was danger, and the robot would warn with their hands going crazy. So we need to make sure that our nonverbals line up with our verbals. If I'm compassionate, I can use my hands to put my hands on my heart to say, I feel for you. In traveling and doing some training internationally, I think this is somewhat of a universal sign to let people know you're with them or that you agree, bowing and using nonverbals. I think this and turning away is probably universal as well, but we have to be careful about how we do that, because if you do it right while somebody's talking, it could be dismissive. It could be something that is dangerous. So taking the time to notice our reaction to other people non-verbally is part of the battle of conflict. Part of the battle of conflict is that sometimes we want to stress our point so vehemently that we don't take time to watch how the other person's responding to us. If you're talking to someone and they're cowering away and moving back like I'm moving now, chances are you're intimidated. Chances are that's bullying. Chances are they're taking it in a different way than what I'm intending. So I've got to be careful in my nonverbal communication as well as my verbal when people are responding to me. So it's me responding to their responses. That's an important piece. That's not just psychological, it's physiological as well, because if I'm standing over someone using a loud voice and my hands and my fingers are pointing, then chances are it could be misinterpreted and the conflict may not be resolved. It could escalate and become even a physical altercation. And we've seen that happen in a lot of places where people may have felt invaded their space. We have somewhat of an arm length bubble in which we call our personal space. And when I do this workshop or I talk about this subject in person, I have people do this as an example. You raise your arms out to your left or your right, and then you put them in front and behind, and that space is called your personal space bubble. When people are inside of that space, you become vulnerable to that person. And so often we have to, or should, ask, can I step into your space, or can we talk? And as you inch or move forward, if that person inches or moves back, what's happening is that they're preserving their space. That can also be psychological space. I don't know if it's 2.5 or 3 feet, like our arms or the average arm span, but we have to take that into consideration. And so this whole conflict management and resolution thing it could be exhaustive if you're not conscientious about learning. Oh wow, I'm 3 feet. I'm really close to them. I need to watch my volume or watch the words that I'm using if they're flinching or moving back while I'm talking. It could also be a case of mouthwash or the absence of mouthwash or those things. So we got to be conscientious. Questions or thoughts?
Hey, Terrence, on your last bullet and kind of going along what you were just talking about. So it's not only taking notice of our reaction to others, but also our reaction or the reaction of us on others.
Yes.
Right. So it's the two-way street. What we may be doing may be indeed impacting the other individual, and being responsive to those cues also will go help resolve the conflict.
Yeah, it's an interesting dance because you think about a coach and his team player. If the team player made a bad move and the coach calls that individual out of the game and the coach is right up in their face, the coach can do that based on the relationship that the coach has. But a member from the opposing team gets up in the face of a team member, you're going to get a conflict that may actually create physical altercation. And so think about that in our work. Let's transfer that to our work scenarios. If I'm the manager and I have a coaching relationship, I could probably talk to somebody like that. But a coworker to coworker, it may not work. Or I may not have that relationship. I may try to assume that relationship, and then I get up in somebody's face and they file a grievance against me, or they feel as if I violated their personal space. Thanks for sharing that, Scott. Somebody else had one or something?
Yeah, I have a quick question, comment kind of thing. Now, how does it work when you send an email out as far as nonverbal communication? You send an email out, you get no reply, you keep asking questions, hey, did you get my email? And nothing happens. How does that come into the nonverbal communication step?
That's a good question, because somebody's obviously exercising avoidance in that one. Now that we live in a world of technology, we know that emails do send and they receive. There are ways to find out if they've opened the email. There are ways to volume of intensity on the urgency of that email. And I learned early on that when you type something in all caps, it's almost as if you've raised your voice. If all else fails, call them. And then if that fails, drive to wherever they are. No, I think what's important is maybe finding the protocols that are acceptable in that space or environment. Somebody may say to you, oh, I hardly ever answer emails. It's best for you to text me. Or someone may say, well, I didn't respond to your email because I felt like you should have called me. Or somebody may say, email is not the way to handle what it is that we need to deal with. But either way, your nonverbal communication as an email is being responded to by their nonverbal response or lack thereof. And so you'll have to use the alternative factor, where we find an alternative way in that ACT approach. What are the alternatives to the email? So you think they might be ignoring you, Elmer?
No, they're probably a little bit busy.
Yeah. Do you have a way to know if they open the email or not?
Yeah, you could put a read receipt on it, see if they read the email or not, or a text or something like that.
Yeah. So the first one would be, hey, Terrence, give me a call. We need to talk about ABC. I ignore you. The second one is, hey, I noticed you read my email, but I need to talk to you urgently. When's a good time to talk? Now you've increased the responsibility on my part to respond to you. because you're asking me a direct question of when we can talk, not if you want to respond to me. It's give me a good time. Or you can even paraphrase it to say, hey, looking for a good time to connect, handling the ABC project. So there are a variety of ways, but I think it's important to know that our response, if we're frustrated because they ignored us and we express that frustration, we could escalate the conflict. Because it's not a conflict if I don't respond. It's only a conflict in your mind because I didn't respond to you. But it's not a conflict for me because I never even dealt with it. So situation and conflict kind of overlap. What's the situation? If I ignore the situation, then yep, it's a conflict. But the situation doesn't have to be a conflict. It could be, we need to resolve this before it becomes a conflict. And then after conflict is consequences. After conflict is consequences. So you have a situation, then you have a conflict, and then you have consequences. And then probably repercussions after that. So after consequences are the repercussions. And so depending on the dynamic, the relationship, and the issue will determine how quickly that could escalate. Thanks for sharing, Elma. Almost done here. Let's look at resolving. The next slide, Antonio. Resolving, resolution. Let's go to resolution. Let's see here. Did I miss one? I'm going to back up a little bit to active listening. Oh, there we go. That's the one I'm looking at. Resolving conflict by building trust. That was one of the elements on the ideal work environment. In building trust, these are some of the pretenses that have to be in place. And I'm very confident based on the time that I've spent with the Rosewood Group and these academies that you have these in your values, your governing values, but everyone matters. Even though I may have a conflict with you, you matter. Or even though you may have a conflict with me, I need to know that you understand that I matter. I had a situation yesterday. There's some work going on in our building, and the contractor was there meeting drywallers. And the drywallers were unloading the drywall. I was trying to talk to the contractor, but he was trying to talk to the drywallers. And I said something or asked a question, and I didn't interrupt. He wasn't talking to them. But he completely ignored the fact that, I was trying to introduce myself, to tell him, where the bathroom was for his contractors, how to get water, all the logistics. Well, he pretty much kind of dissed or ignored the fact that I was trying to talk to him. And it created a conflict in my mind first. And then I thought, okay, maybe he's a unitracked kind of person, one track mind. He couldn't focus on what he was about to say to the contractors or the workers. And talk to me at the same time. But I felt for a moment that he was being dismissive. And he turned around and he apologized. He says, oh, I apologize. I wasn't ignoring you. I wanted to make sure that these guys unloaded the drywall properly. He qualified it, but in that slight moment, in that space, I felt like, well, maybe he doesn't know how much I really do matter because I'm signing the check on his contract. So it really has everything to do with how we view ourselves in the environment and how we view others. They matter. Openly and honestly, I said, yeah, that did feel a bit dismissive, but all I wanted to tell you was the bathrooms are located here and there's a cooler with water there. And so I was being open and honest about the fact that, yep, it felt dismissive because as I was talking, he was only 3 feet away. When I said, hey, I'd like to share something with you, he walked away while I was talking. And so openness and honesty can help to avoid it. So we're good now. Everything's cool. But in that moment, it was a potential conflict situation because I'm not as so egocentric to think that you're supposed to pay attention to me right now. No, I understood. And I was able to piece the two together. I did find out a little bit later that there were some language barriers between him and the workers. And so he was trying to avoid or avert conflict in communicating with them. And he got back to me. So I have to model the behavior that I want to see in the people that I'm communicating with. So one of the things about resolving conflict is that I can't expect or tell somebody something and then I'm not willing to do that myself, or I'm not willing to participate at the level of showing someone what needs to be done in order to avoid further conflict. So if there's something that's unacceptable, I need to be able to communicate that, but I also need to take into consideration that everybody's thoughts, perceptions, or uniquenesses, they matter. And that's a diversity conversation. It's not just ethnicity, it's not just language barriers, but that's even in our thought processes, our schooling, our upbringing, our experiences. So looking at all three of these, the disconnect oftentimes comes when we have to model the behavior. So modeled behavior helps tremendously in resolving conflict. Any thoughts or questions about that? I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one, right?
Terrence, I think there's a good point where you started on everyone matters and respect. You know, I often say if you evaluate really how you're doing and living out the values or who you want to be, by only how you treat people that align with you or agree with you, you are likely not getting a very accurate reflection of yourself. That's not much of a testament of the values, is treat those who do a great job in alignment with the values. So when you say everyone matters, remember that's the ones that you are in conflict with.
Yeah.
That's when you actually show your true colors, not when you're preaching to the choir.
Choir, right.
That's easy to do. So
yeah. Very good observation, Chandler. I think that when we value everyone at the same level, you know, when we just start out with they're human, I'm human, they get 100%, start there and then work our way. I do know that there are times when our biases or our previous experiences or our values that may be different than someone else's, they kick in. And so we have to be really on our toes or conscientious about remembering everyone matters, everyone matters, everyone matters. And I'm an everyone. So I want to matter to somebody else. So I'm a firm believer in the law of sowing and reaping. You know, sometimes we say reaping and sowing. Well, actually you sow first and then you reap after that. So when I put that out, when I put out everyone matters, hopefully that's what will come back to me. Yeah, great point. Thanks. Our next slide. So, of course, building trust, but what we're striving for is what's that question? Do we want our personal goals met? Do I just want to get, you know, my next bonus or raise because my team did the job? Or are my personal goals related to the team goals? And are we sharing team goals? And how do they fit in the overall organizational goals? Now, you might be saying, well, what does this have to do with conflict and conflict management or resolution? Well, this is where it happens. This is exactly where the conflict occurs, is when my personal goals don't line up with the team goals, or the team's goals don't line up with my personal goals, and my personal goals are out of sync with the organizational goals. Now, that's a little eggheadish right now because I'm knee deep in organizational behavior, and I think that it's valuable to consider how conflict is an indication that our goals are not matching up. Conflict is a very good indicator that perhaps a situation is happening or happened that shows me we're not on the same page toward the goals. Now, while there are different pages and we may not be at the same pace, the goal for both persons as well as their teams should be to land on the same page of the organization's goals. And so those metaphors of being in the page or on the page is oftentimes where we miss it, because we'll walk away from a actuality. It's just a matter of flipping the page, turning the page. We should be striving toward that. So I pose to you the question of, what are you striving for? Do you want just your personal goal met, or do you want to reach the goal of the teams, and are the teams all tuned into the organizational goals? And if we flip this and we put organizational goals at the top, are the organizational goals taking into consideration that there are some personal goals here and there are some team goals? If the organization is concerned, meaning management, leadership, and those in authority, then they'll sort out what are the personal goals. Is it to just get a paycheck, or are the personal goals to make a difference in the world through both my job as well as the people that I encounter every day? So my personal goals may be different than someone else's. Somebody else may just be there for a job, and maybe temporarily, or it may be I'm striving toward progression to become better. So we've got a lot of different goals in the room. Where do we land? Hopefully the organizational goals, and like I said, Rosewood does a good job of communicating values that can help people find their goals, their personal goals in there, as well as the team goals. Any other thoughts? Let's move to the next slide, Antonio. Thank you. So the adaptability and flexibility I kind of alluded to. I alluded to being adaptable. I think it was also mentioned a little earlier about making the adjustments that are necessary or compromise or negotiation. When we are in conflict, negotiation is not weakness. When we're in conflict, adapting, not a bad thing. When we're in conflict, I think it's really important for us to be able to adapt and become more flexible, because a tree that will bend won't break. A tree that bends won't break. In fact, it's grounded or rooted in its values or its core initiatives, but it's willing to bend with the wind. And I think that as long as it doesn't compromise the overall values or even the safety of individuals within an organization, a true conflict manager knows how to be flexible. If I need to adapt my tone, my voice, my word choices, my spatial distance, if I need to adapt those things in order to get to conflict resolution, then I could probably find myself more in a winning situation than losing. If I'm flexible with times, I'm flexible with maybe even the mechanisms by which I communicate with people, then I can be a little bit more effective. I have a person on one of my teams that no matter how many times I poll the group for when's the time for a good meeting, they always come back with, that's not going to work for me. That's just not going to work for me. And I think they're communicating to me non-verbally that either they don't want to be a part of the team, or I should delegate the meeting planning to them. Notice how I've flipped the script. So if it's not going to work for you, let's start with what will, and then we'll adapt, or we can be flexible. And that's because I want to empower them to be a part of the team. They're very influential. They're one of the most influential voices on the whole team. And their influence could easily be used against us. Notice I said that. And I can't take it personal as the leader of the team or the organization, but what I can say is I need to navigate that influence and let them take some leadership, and I'll be more adaptable and flexible until we have to move otherwise. So some people mistakenly think that the ability to change according to the needs of the situation or the willingness to compromise is weakness or lack of conviction, but it's really not. If you notice, the method to my madness is to put them in the driver's seat and see how they fare. I know that they're not destructive toward themselves, but Mark Bienoff said this: you must always be able to predict what's next and have the flexibility to evolve. To evolve. There's a final quote that I'd like to leave with you, and it comes from a man of wisdom that we know from ancient texts as well. And the next slide gives me something that I would say is the bottom line for my conflict resolution skills. That gentle words turn away wrath, but harsh words will produce hatred. That's a different translation, but Solomon was noted for his wisdom. And if we were to apply any wisdom to this whole idea of conflict and conflict resolution, we could go with the greats. We can go with those who are noted for their wisdom. And Solomon says this, that words, gentle words that are kind, words that are palatable for people to swallow, words that are kind are actually instruments that will divert or turn wrath or anger. But when words are harsh, or when words come from a place of hardness, they produce hatred. And I don't think that's coincidental. That might be experiential that he's able to make that statement. And I'm sure that many of us can think about times when we matched fire with fire and we had harsh words in exchange with another person, that there was hatred, even if it was just in that moment. But the gentle words, even if harsh words are coming at you, gentle words will literally cause wrath to be turned away. With that, I'm going to pause or stop and allow you all to ask questions or share your summative thoughts or ideas as we come to the close of the presentation.
I'll throw one in on that previous slide. It looks like Solomon had a Twitter page. Is that?
Yes. Solomon's on Twitter, if there were Twitters
That's
at that time.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you indirectly brought up several times is the need for intentionality.
Yep.
So, making choices about our approach, about the words that we use, about our nonverbals, And I mean, that takes a little extra work to not just do what comes naturally. You hear people say, well, this is just me. You got to take me how I am. And which is a great way to start a conflict. Or to escalate a conflict when people are saying, this is just my personality, deal with it.
Are you talking about marriage? Are you talking about marriage or work? Or both?
I'm gonna refrain from comment on that.
You're right, though.
Even in the chat, somebody posted, once frustration sets in, all bets are off. Again, you've got to choose not to act on your frustration, and to, if you have to go someplace and cool off for a minute, that's what you do. So.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned that it was perceived, that I was just talking about that. You're absolutely correct. The goal would be to help people understand I'm in control of me. I'm not in control of someone else. And if I take that responsibility of being in control of me, it can oftentimes empower me to help resolve the conflict. But if, it's bear after bear, we're going to have some blood, some carnage. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Dr. Fubara. Other thoughts or comments, questions, maybe?
Actually, sorry.
Go ahead, Jessica. You're fine.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of going off of what you said, my mother always taught me, you can't control what other people say or do, but you can control how you react to them.
Yes.
And that is something I have always lived by.
I think that's an excellent mom-ism, as they would say. My mother used to always say, those other people are not my child, you are. Go ahead.
No, I say that a lot. That's their problem. No, I always try and repeat back. If someone's coming to me with a conflict, I'll repeat back what they're saying and then say, okay, this is what I hear you're saying, but this is what I think you mean. Because sometimes what they're saying isn't actually what they're meaning to get across. They're, maybe saying I like the color red, but what they really meant to say was, I really want cherries. Or, you know what I mean? I know that sounds silly as a metaphor, but sometimes they don't realize the words that they're putting out there is not what they're really meaning to say. And so they're having a hard time and they're struggling. And they get frustrated because they're struggling with getting their point across. So sometimes I like to take just a step back and then I'll say, okay, you said this, this, and this. Is that what you meant? Because that's how everyone's perceiving it. If that's what you meant, then we'll go forward with, to the next step. If what you really meant was this, this, and this, then, we need to make sure we're all on the same page so we know what the true conflict is. Because sometimes I think people will say, timing's an issue and I can't make it to this meeting because timing's an issue. Well, that's not really the true conflict. The conflict is they can't find childcare. You know what I'm saying? It's something else, but that's what's being perceived. So, sometimes we need to figure out what the true conflict is so we can get to the root. And if they're really being aggressive and they're, I will take a step back because then they know I'm not being aggressive back. I'm not, exhibiting those symptoms or whatever, and then taking it down and giving them a moment. And then once we both agree that this is the issue and this is what we need to work on, then trying to find mutual understanding.
Yeah.
And go from there.
I like how you use the analogy that they may have a need, even though they're communicating a preference. They could say, hey, I like so-and-so when there's actually a need there.
And if none of that works, then you kill it with kindness.
That's true, but you can say, help me better understand. You say, this is what I'm perceiving, help me to better understand. Or can you elaborate? You can use that term. I say that often. Can you elaborate? Tell me more, give me more. And then I'm searching through my little battery of tools or my glossary of terms to listen for words that describe these are, and it's not really a lot of hard work, but if you listen closely to what's being said and to what's not being said, those two bookends kind of gives you what's in the middle. Great. Saw a hand pop up or?
Yeah, hey, this is Houston. So for people that have worked with me or worked around me, they know that I'm a very process kind of based person. And so I kind of wanted to just lay out how I think through some of this, and it feeds into a lot of what you've talked about today. Is first, if we have the environment where we can be open and transparent, Chandler and Matt talk about truth with charity and kind of how we communicate with each other, that sets up a precedent of good open communication, which can resolve some of these conflict measures. But once a conflict kind of comes into play, I kind of compartmentalize it as, is this a functional conflict or dysfunctional conflict? And functional conflict is often based on process or the thing we're talking about, trying to come up with the best strategy or the best way to tackle an issue. And there's going to be kind of friction in terms of how to determine how to get there in the best path. And so I try to recognize if it is that, then I want to actually incite that and push that forward to drive innovation. But once it turns into a dysfunctional conflict, and there could be a number of sources for that, whether it's just personal values or differences, information deficiencies, just stress. I think Sherry talked about, if they don't have childcare, I mean, you may not see that in what they're saying to you directly, but it could be in the back of their mind that's kind of causing some of the rifts there. And then from there, once you diagnose what you think that is from a dysfunctional perspective, then try to understand what conflict management approach you can take, whether it's, I'm going to accommodate this individual at this point in time, I'm going to avoid the conflict altogether because it's not the right time to talk about it, or try to utilize a compromising or accommodating, or collaboration approach to try to get a win-win out of the scenario. So that's kind of a quick 3-step process that I try to utilize and do quickly. Try to critically think through that to come up with the best solution in any specific, conflict resolution situation.
I love it. I think we have to be conscientious there too about not imposing our values on someone else. When it comes to that, just being sensitive. And I think that that's what you're expressing in your sentiments, that we have to be sensitive to what the person's needs really are. In most of our training, I use a model that talks about personal needs and practical needs. And I like how that was part of your step. So there's some practical things. We need this done now. But the personal need is, I'm not available now. I can be available then or at another time. So I agree 100%. We've got to compartmentalize to an extent and then be willing to listen with our hearts. And I think it's safe to say that with the Rosewood Group. Listen with our hearts, not just your ears. Great. Other comments or thoughts? These are good.
Tarence, Scott, I have two questions for you. Just kind of going along what Houston just talked about around the dysfunctional conflict, and you mentioned values. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I'm always trying to figure out, how does this tie into our values? And then there's a book called The Messy Middle, and the author, Scott Belsky, said, basically, whatever triggers your frustrations or irritations are rooted in one or more of the core values that you have, something that you're vehemently for or against. And so my question to you was, how much of conflict is really because of a challenge to one's values, whether that's personal values or organizational values? Because Houston mentioned the functional versus dysfunctional, and I'm wondering how much of all of this kind of rolls around a values misalignment.
I think that's really a good, well, two questions, but one, I'll tackle the one specifically about conflict aligning or misaligning with our values. I would say a large percentage, if not all of it, is that. So we have to learn how to modify how we communicate our values. Statements, absolute statements, for example, are not a good way of being able to express our values. I would never do that. Well, you may never do that, but I do. And I do it on a regular basis as much as I can and hope I never get caught. No. So the thing is, I got to learn how to communicate my value because it's a pre-existing conflict. If I go in, a person's doing work a certain way and I think it should be done this way based on my value. Well, I've got to be open enough to first assess where their values are concerning that. Time is a good example. Some people value time differently than others. Those who have had life-threatening experiences probably have a whole different take than somebody who's had it really good and easy in their lives. And I say good and easy, not in a bad way, but they haven't had any of those challenges. And so they value time differently. Or somebody who's handling multiple priorities like children and childcare and transportation and things like that. Their assessment of time may be skewed or different than somebody who doesn't have any of those responsibilities. So it's incumbent upon us as individuals to go into situations with, here are my values. They could create conflict. But remember, conflict is only conflict internally first, but it only becomes a conflict when I express what it is that I'm thinking, or when you express what it is that you're thinking that doesn't align with what I'm thinking. And conflict is not all bad. There are some good conflicts, and we have to think about functional versus dysfunctional. So if it's functional problem, we can solve it. If it's dysfunctional, we just got problem after problem after problem. And what happens is that it escalates to a situation. The situation creates circumstances, and circumstances eventually repercussions. So thanks for sharing that. All right. I think we are a little over an hour. We started a little behind, but Antonio, you want to take it from there? Or I don't know if Chandler or Dr. Fubara had anything else?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add that's become a little more recent that I've heard a lot in the last year is the difference in a peacekeeper and a peacemaker. And so the peacemaker is an active role that is almost even prior to Scott's values of how do you approach the conflict. To your point in Houston and Scott's, once the outcome becomes maybe unacceptable, then maybe that does, if the conflict truly is going to create an outcome you can't accept, then you do kind of change from the peacemaker maybe to the peacekeeper of, there's other priorities here, but that peacemaker is an active role that's seeking to pay attention to how you're perceived, their other needs, their other thoughts, their values versus your values, as opposed to peacekeeper is just, you might gravitate towards the acceptance and avoidance because it keeps everything calm, which doesn't actually get to a good resolution.
Yeah, I like that. Peacekeeper, peacemaker, I love it. Are there other thoughts or questions?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you. And that concludes our September Leadership Live. You got a lot of good feedback, Terence. I just saw a comment from Jessica. This is the most beneficial Leadership Live she's been part of. So, like I said, we're a big fan of you. So hopefully we'll have you on a fourth one, maybe at the end of the year. So you got one more quarter to go. But no, I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone who joined. We had a good attendance, so thank you for everybody spending time. So again, Terence, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Have a good one.